Tommy the Shadow Malone, feared enforcer of Liverpool's streets, and Frankie the broker Rossi, the mastermind behind its hidden empire, controlled the city in ways no one could see. From brutal violence to secret deals, these men ruled from the shadows, and their influence shaped Liverpool for decades. This is the untold story of the Liverpool Mafia, how power, fear, and betrayal controlled an entire city. Liverpool was a city of contrasts. On the surface, it thrived with bustling docks, lively markets, and music that echoed through the streets. Tourists admired its historic architecture, football fans cheered in packed stadiums, and families went about their daily lives. Yet beneath the surface, an invisible force had begun to take shape, one that few noticed at first. Small incidents that seemed unrelated began to form a pattern. Businesses mysteriously failing despite success, shipments disappearing from warehouses, and a quiet intimidation that lingered in neighborhoods. Rumors started to circulate about a hidden criminal network that had slowly taken root in the city. People whispered the name Liverpool Mafia, though no one outside its inner circles knew who ran it or how deep its influence went. In the late 1990s, the city's streets were alive with both opportunity and danger. The docks were the heart of Liverpool's economy, bringing in goods from around the world, but they also became a perfect playground for organized crime. The Mafia had learned to exploit the city's strengths while keeping its presence mostly hidden. Their operations were sophisticated, blending into ordinary life so seamlessly that many residents went years without realizing how controlled their city had become. From the outside, everything seemed normal, yet the Mafia had begun to dictate who thrived and who failed, silently manipulating the flow of money and power. The network was built carefully, step by step. At first, it was small-scale crime, petty thefts, smuggling minor goods, and intimidating small business owners to ensure compliance. But as the group gained confidence, they expanded into more dangerous and lucrative activities, including drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and even weapons sales. Their strategy was simple yet effective: remain mostly unseen, but make it clear that resistance was costly. Rumors of accidents and mysterious disappearances were enough to ensure obedience. Those who questioned the Mafia quickly learned that fear was a more effective tool than force, and the city's residents slowly adapted to this hidden reality. Even the police and local authorities were not immune. Some officers were bribed, others intimidated, and a few even cooperated willingly. Investigations into these crimes often ran into dead ends, as witnesses disappeared or evidence vanished. The Mafia's influence reached into places most people assumed were safe. Ordinary citizens were careful to avoid trouble, understanding that the streets had silent rulers they could neither see nor challenge openly. By the end of the decade, Liverpool had transformed. Its streets, once chaotic but free, had become a city governed by invisible rules. The Mafia had created an empire built on fear, secrecy, and careful planning. Residents learned to coexist with the shadow that loomed over their lives, never fully understanding who controlled it or how. The stage was set for the rise of enforcers, rivalries, and betrayals that would eventually turn Liverpool into one of the most notorious hubs for organized crime in the UK. But in these early years, the city only glimpsed the outlines of a hidden world one that would soon dominate headlines, law enforcement efforts, and the lives of everyone who lived there. The shadows of Liverpool had grown long, stretching into every neighborhood, every street, and every corner of the docks. The Mafia was no longer just a rumor or a whispered warning. It was becoming an unseen hand, shaping the fate of a city that thought it was still free. The rise of the enforcers marked a turning point in Liverpool's hidden criminal world. They were the backbone of the Mafia, men whose presence alone could bend the city to their will. They didn't need to shout or draw attention. Their reputation was enough to instill fear. Local pubs, gambling dens, shipping warehouses, and even quiet neighborhood streets all fell under their silent control. Business owners quickly learned that paying protection fees was not a choice, it was a necessity. Those who refused often found their properties vandalized, deliveries mysteriously delayed, or competitors suddenly thriving while their own businesses struggled to survive. The enforcers operated with a precision that seemed almost military, moving in ways that left the average citizen unaware of the danger lurking nearby. These men were not typical street criminals. Each had a role carefully assigned within the organization. Some specialized in intimidation, their names whispered in corners of the city as if invoking them might bring immediate trouble. Others handled logistics, ensuring that money, drugs, and weapons flowed through the city without detection. The most dangerous were those who coordinated violence, planning strikes against rivals or anyone who dared cross the mafia. They were ruthless, calculating, and above all, loyal to the organization, not to any individual. Their loyalty was cemented through fear, shared interests, and the unspoken understanding that betrayal meant death. The streets of Liverpool soon became a chessboard. Every corner, alley, and warehouse was part of a larger game, and the enforcers were the pieces moving strategically across it. Ordinary people often walked past them without realizing it, unaware that the men sitting in quiet pubs or leaning against walls were orchestrating events that could decide the fate of neighborhoods. The mafia's control extended beyond crime. It affected daily life in ways subtle and profound. Grocery deliveries, taxi services, and even local festivals had to be negotiated through channels controlled by the enforcers. This network of influence created a sense of order, but one that came at a high price: the city's freedom. Despite their fearsome reputation, the enforcers were careful to maintain invisibility. Violence was used sparingly and deliberately, often reserved for moments when it would send the strongest message. Rumors of brutal retribution traveled faster than the acts themselves, allowing the mafia to control without constant bloodshed. The city learned to obey, not because of daily attacks, but because of the fear of what might happen if the rules were broken. It was an unspoken contract between the enforcers and the residents, compliance in exchange for safety. As the early 2000s approached, the enforcers became more organized and strategic. They began to expand operations into previously untapped areas, such as smuggling high-value goods through the docks and infiltrating legitimate businesses to launder money. Each move was calculated, leaving law enforcement struggling to catch up. The more visible the mafia appeared to outsiders, the less it actually revealed about the true power structure behind it. Enforcers became almost mythical figures in the city's imagination, figures whose presence could be felt everywhere, yet seen by almost no one. By controlling fear, loyalty, and information, the enforcers ensured that the mafia's grip on Liverpool only tightened over time. They were the silent rulers, shaping lives, businesses, and neighborhoods while remaining almost entirely invisible. Their rise was a turning point. The city had entered a new era where power was measured not by votes or wealth, but by the unseen hand guiding the streets. Liverpool's mafia had found its strongest tool, and the enforcers wielded it with unmatched precision. Power is a fragile thing, especially when it is built on fear and secrecy. By the early 2000s, the Liverpool Mafia had grown into a sprawling network, but the very success that gave them control also sowed the seeds of internal conflict. The organization, once tightly knit, began to fracture as ambitions grew and rivalries emerged. Longtime allies who had once trusted each other implicitly started to question loyalty, each one eyeing the wealth and influence that came with control of the city's criminal operations. The enforcers, who had maintained order on the streets, suddenly found themselves caught in a web of suspicion, where even a small mistake could be interpreted as betrayal. It started subtly. Deals were delayed, shipments were rerouted without explanation, and whispers of secret alliances circulated in the shadows. At first, these incidents were dismissed as ordinary criminal risk, but soon it became clear that a major power struggle was underway. A key lieutenant, once considered untouchable, vanished without warning. Rumors spread quickly through the streets. Some said he had been double-crossed by a trusted partner. Others believed he had attempted to seize control and was eliminated to prevent a coup. His disappearance shocked the organization, shaking the confidence of members and allies alike. The Mafia's inner circle, which had always presented a united front, now faced internal chaos, and the streets themselves seemed to grow tenser as the instability spread. The consequences of this betrayal rippled far beyond the inner workings of the Mafia. Rival gangs sensed weakness and began probing for opportunities, launching small attacks and testing the limits of the organization's power. Neighborhoods that had once been firmly under Mafia control experienced sudden outbreaks of violence, leaving residents fearful and uncertain. The delicate balance of fear and obedience, carefully maintained for years, began to falter. Even law enforcement, who had struggled for decades to infiltrate the organization, sensed a rare opportunity to gather intelligence and make arrests. Yet the Mafia's adaptability and cunning meant that the threat of exposure was only temporary. Betrayal also created a climate of paranoia. Every meeting, every transaction was scrutinized for hidden motives. Members who had once been considered loyal now faced suspicion and scrutiny. Decisions were no longer made swiftly. Every action was measured against the possibility of treachery. The enforcers, once the unshakable pillars of authority, found their own influence tested as factions within the organization vied for supremacy. Trust, once the currency of power, became a rare and precious commodity. Amidst the turmoil, the city itself became a reflection of the Mafia's internal struggles. Streets once ruled with quiet intimidation now witnessed occasional violent outbursts, leaving residents anxious and fearful. Businesses that had paid protection fees faithfully discovered that alliances within the Mafia could shift overnight, and what was safe one day could become dangerous the next. Liverpool had always been a city of resilience, but the invisible battle waging behind closed doors added a new layer of uncertainty, one that ordinary citizens could feel but rarely understood. The betrayal of a single lieutenant revealed the precarious nature of power within the Mafia. It was a stark reminder that even the most formidable empires are vulnerable from within, and that ambition, greed, and mistrust can destabilize the strongest organizations. Amid the chaos, one enforcer emerged as a particularly formidable force. Ruthless and cunning, he navigated the violent war with an almost strategic genius. He orchestrated attacks against rival gangs in ways that minimized exposure for the Cons Mafia while maximizing the psychological impact. News reports of shootings, bombings, and mysterious deaths circulated through the city, but few connected the dots to the enforcer's precise planning. His presence alone was enough to keep rivals on edge, never daring to make a bold move against the organization without first considering the consequences. The drug trade itself was a sophisticated operation. It was not limited to street-level distribution. The Mafia had built a layered system that extended from suppliers overseas to local dealers who were carefully monitored. High-level negotiations determined which neighborhoods would be supplied and which would be avoided to prevent law enforcement attention. Money flowed through the same hidden financial networks previously established, ensuring the profits were laundered and reinvested efficiently. The system was designed to operate like a machine, with every individual knowing their role, and any misstep punished swiftly. Rival gangs were relentless, however. Some sought to challenge the Mafia's control, while others aimed to profit from the chaos without fully aligning with either side. The enforcer's strategic approach often involved deception as much as violence, false alliances, carefully leaked information, and sudden ambush that kept competitors constantly off balance. Residents of affected neighborhoods were caught in the crossfire, forced to navigate a city where safety was uncertain, and the rules were dictated by shadowy figures whose faces they rarely saw. Even law enforcement, long frustrated by the Mafia's secrecy, struggled to respond. Each raid or arrest was met with adaptation from the organization. Leaders changed tactics, routes were altered, and operations became more covert. The city became a chessboard of criminal strategy, with the enforcer as the master player, moving pieces silently, efficiently, and without mercy. By the end of this violent chapter, Liverpool's streets had been transformed. The drug war had left neighborhoods fearful, families cautious, and rival gangs wary of the Mafia's continued dominance. Yet the organization remained unbroken. Its ability to combine brutality, strategy, and fear ensured that the empire continued to thrive even amidst chaos. The city had entered an era defined not only by criminal ambition, but by calculated terror, and the question on everyone's mind was how long the war would continue before the balance of power shifted again. By 2008, the Liverpool Mafia had reached a level of dominance that seemed untouchable. Its operations ran like a well-oiled machine, with money flowing through hidden networks, enforcers controlling the streets, and rivals kept in check through fear and calculated violence. Yet even the most formidable empires have cracks, and in this case, it came from within. A low-level member, one who had operated mostly in the shadows and remained unnoticed for years, made a decision that would shake the foundation of the organization. He became an informant. The decision was not made lightly. Fear and loyalty had always been the Mafia's greatest weapons, and betrayal was punished with absolute severity. But the informant had grown disillusioned, realizing that life within the organization offered little but danger, uncertainty, and a constant threat of death. By cooperating with law enforcement, he hoped not only to save himself but to expose the hidden mechanisms of power that had controlled Liverpool for over a decade. What he revealed was nothing short of shocking. Details of secret bank accounts, hidden meeting locations, shipment routes, and the identities of high-ranking members provided law enforcement with a roadmap into the organization's inner workings. Armed with this information, authorities launched a series of raids and arrests that targeted both the visible and invisible layers of the Mafia. Warehouses were searched, records seized, and several mid-level enforcers detained. The city watched with a mix of awe and fear as news reports detailed arrests that had once seemed impossible. It was the first real evidence that the Mafia was not invincible, and for many residents, it offered a glimmer of hope that the shadow that had ruled their neighborhoods might finally be lifted. Yet the organization proved remarkably resilient. Even with the informant's revelations, the Mafia adapted quickly, shifting operations, changing personnel, and exploiting weaknesses in law enforcement to continue its activities. Many of the city's neighborhoods remained under their influence, and the arrests created only temporary disruption. The enforcers, now wary of further betrayals, tightened their control, becoming more secretive and unpredictable than ever before. The informant had struck a blow, but it was not enough to dismantle the empire entirely. The psychological impact of the informant's cooperation was significant. Trust, already fragile due to previous internal betrayals, became even more scarce. Every meeting, every transaction, and every alliance was scrutinized for hidden motives. Paranoia spread among members, with some disappearing or relocating to avoid suspicion. The Mafia's culture of fear, which had once relied primarily on the threat of external violence, now had to contend with the threat from within. Members learned that loyalty alone was no longer enough. Survival depended on careful calculation and constant vigilance. For law enforcement, the informant represented both an opportunity and a challenge. His information offered unprecedented access, but the organization's adaptability meant that each new strategy had to be carefully monitored. It became a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, with the city itself caught in the middle. Neighborhoods experienced brief relief, only to witness the Mafia reassert control in new, more sophisticated ways. The story of the informant illustrated a central truth about organized crime. Even the most powerful and secretive empires are vulnerable to human decisions, ambition, and fear. But it also highlighted the organization's strength, its ability to survive, adapt, and continue operating under extreme pressure. The empire was shaken, but it was far from defeated, leaving Liverpool's streets caught between hope and the enduring shadow of a criminal machine that refused to be entirely undone. By 2012, the pressure on the Liverpool Mafia had reached a tipping point. Years of law enforcement investigations, informants, and public scrutiny had finally forced a major crackdown. High-ranking members were arrested, facing charges ranging from drug trafficking to extortion and money laundering. For the first time, the city witnessed the public exposure of the men who had ruled the streets in silence for over a decade. Headlines screamed of Liverpool's Mafia City, and residents felt a mix of relief, curiosity, and lingering fear. Yet beneath the surface, the empire was far from fully dismantled. The arrests revealed only part of the organization's true structure. While several leaders were behind bars, many others had already adapted, slipping into lower profiles or relocating operations to avoid detection. New leaders quietly stepped into the power vacuum, ensuring continuity in the mafia's activities. The organization's network of hidden financial accounts, loyal enforcers, and political connections allowed it to maintain influence even as its most visible members faced prosecution. To the outside world, it appeared as though justice had prevailed, but in reality, the empire's core remained intact. Neighborhoods that had once been under strict control experienced a temporary reprieve from intimidation and violence. Residents dared to hope that the city could finally breathe, free from the grip of unseen rulers. But this calm was deceptive. The mafia had learned from past betrayals and raids, becoming smarter and more discreet. Operations shifted further underground, relying on technology, coded communications, and trusted intermediaries to continue criminal activities. Businesses previously exploited for money laundering were adjusted to appear even more legitimate, making detection by authorities increasingly difficult. Even within the legal system, the mafia's influence persisted. Bribes, threats, and covert alliances ensured that some cases were delayed, weakened, or quietly dropped. Investigators faced constant frustration, realizing that while arrests disrupted the organization, they could not entirely sever its reach. The city itself had become a landscape where justice and crime coexisted uneasily. Residents quickly learned that public victories against the mafia often masked the reality that power and influence had simply shifted into subtler forms. The partial collapse also sparked a wave of speculation and paranoia among rival gangs. Some tried to seize territory, believing the arrests signaled weakness. Others were cautious, aware that the organization's adaptability made it a dangerous adversary, even when appearing vulnerable. Streets that had been calm under enforced control now became stages for strategic maneuvering, as new players tested loyalties, alliances, and the limits of influence. The mafia, though shaken, had turned vulnerability into an opportunity to refine its operations and secure its survival for another generation. By the end of this era, it was clear that Liverpool had survived a major confrontation with organized crime. But this story was far from over. The arrests provided closure in the public eye, but the hidden structures, networks, and relationships that underpinned the mafia remained resilient. Lessons learned from the crackdown ensured that the organization was more cautious, more secretive, and more capable of surviving challenges in the future. The city had witnessed both triumph and limitation. Law enforcement had struck a blow, but the shadow of the mafia still lingered. Liverpool's criminal empire had suffered, yet it had not been fully eradicated. Its influence continued to ripple through neighborhoods, businesses, and unseen networks, a reminder that power built on secrecy and fear cannot be easily destroyed. The story of collapse was only part of the larger saga in which control, survival, and adaptation remained constant, shaping the city's streets long after the headlines faded. Decades after its rise, the Liverpool Mafia's presence remained a shadow over the city, even as headlines faded and arrests became historical footnotes. Its legacy was not marked only by violence or arrests, but by the subtle, pervasive control it had instilled in neighborhoods, businesses, and even the psyche of the residents. Those who lived through the height of its power remembered the fear, the disappearances, and the unspoken rules that governed daily life. For many, the era of the Mafia was a time when silence was survival, loyalty was life itself, and the streets were a dangerous chessboard where one wrong move could prove fatal. Even after the partial collapse, the Mafia's influence persisted in quieter, less obvious ways. Many of its former enforcers and operatives had either adapted to new roles or trained successors who understood the delicate balance of intimidation and subtle control. Businesses continued to operate under unspoken guidelines: pay your dues, comply with local expectations, and avoid drawing attention. Some industries, nightclubs, pubs, shipping, and retail, remained subtly shaped by networks established long ago. Residents may have thought the violence had ended, but the patterns of influence, fear, and control remained embedded in the city's daily rhythm. The new generation of criminals, some born after the Mafia's initial rise, studied its methods with a mixture of fear and admiration. They learned that the true power of an organization did not lie only in physical strength or gunfire, but in strategy, secrecy, and adaptability. They observed how the Mafia had survived betrayals, law enforcement raids, and internal chaos, and used those lessons to build subtler, smarter networks. In neighborhoods once dominated by overt intimidation, influence was now exercised with quiet authority payments, favors, and strategic alliances, replacing outright threats. The psychological impact on residents was profound. People who had grown up in the shadow of the Mafia learned early the rules of caution, which streets to avoid, which businesses to trust, and how to navigate interactions with those who still held invisible power. Even years later, some families avoided certain areas or refrained from asking questions about sudden wealth or unexplained changes in their neighborhoods. Fear had become a cultural memory, passed down quietly, a constant reminder that the city's history of organized crime could still touch the present. Yet the legacy was not purely one of fear. It was also a story of adaptation and survival. Liverpool's cityscape had changed, shaped in part by the Mafia's activities, and in part by the responses of communities, law enforcement, and businesses. Some neighborhoods grew stronger and more resilient, learning to protect themselves while navigating the complex networks that had once dominated them. Others retained the subtle scars of intimidation and corruption, reminders that influence could persist long after the men behind it were gone. The Mafia's enduring presence in Liverpool was a testament to the power of organization, secrecy, and fear. It showed how an empire could survive disruption and maintain control through invisible means, shaping a city without ever being fully visible. The story of Liverpool's criminal underworld, from its rise to its partial collapse and lingering legacy, revealed a complex reality. That power, once established, rarely disappears entirely, and that the echoes of its influence can last for generations. The city had survived, but the shadow of the Mafia remained a silent, enduring force that continued to shape life on Liverpool's streets in ways few could see but all could feel.